I think if we're in a period where we look back and say, I got that wrong, I do regret the fact that Nevertrump was not a more forceful advocate for centrist politics in both the Democratic and the Republican parties.
Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them. Welcome, Charlie Sykes, to the AVC podcast.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, you were actually on our very first webinar. We didn't call it a podcast back then. We called it webinars. Our very first webinar that we did for American Values Coalition. I looked it up, November 23rd, 2021. So it's been too long since you've been back.
It has been, and a lot's happened since 2021.
Yeah, plenty we could be covering, yes. So Charlie, I can't believe we are at war with Iran. I mean... this is one of those things where I thought that Trump, I know he's kind of wishy-washy on a lot of issues, but I thought, with trade, I thought he was very anti-trade, but he kind of goes back and forth a little bit on that. With immigration, I thought he's pretty solidly xenophobic, but it seems like he's maybe pulling back on that even a little bit. And then the no more wars, I thought that was a pretty solid Trump stance, but apparently not.
Well, apparently millions, if not tens of millions of voters thought that it was the real thing. This was a big part of his appeal back in 2016, no endless wars, the contrast with the quagmire of Iraq. But I think it's David Frum who made the point that, people shouldn't have been so gullible, because this is a guy who likes playing soldier, who likes rattling sabers. And in his first term, he did not pull out of Afghanistan. He may have negotiated a withdrawal, but he left that to his predecessor. He bombed ISIS. So there's always that paradox with Donald Trump that there are clashing impulses. The guy that up until 5 minutes ago was the president of peace, really, really wanted that Nobel Peace Prize, is now bombing the crap out of another country. What can you say?
I know. I can't believe the winner of the FIFA Peace Prize is now bombing Iran.
Exactly.
It is interesting to me how this is now dividing MAGA. But I want to make sure I'm not analyzing this through rose-colored glasses or just wishful thinking. But there seems to be some major disagreements here with Trump, some major splits taking place within this coalition. And it's not the only split within the coalition. They're dividing on a whole bunch of stuff. And it's not, and it seems like the more I look at this, it is such an odd mix of characters. I guess it's always true with any coalition, but it's such an odd mix of characters that it's part of MAGA. And so it's like the very anti-war wing of MAGA, but then there's also this sort of conversation about this debate between the anti-Semites and the pro-Israel wing of MAGA as well. That's kind of getting mixed into that. Can you make sense of this for us?
Ugly. Well, I mean, make sense is a tall order. Yes, you have this debate between the anti-Semites, but also you're having this debate about, so what is this tent? Is this tent big enough that it has Nick Fuentes, the Holocaust denying, Nazi adjacent, influencer? Who would have ever imagined that we would get to this particular point? But let's go back to this big question, because there are conflicting signals here. And I think, don't put on the rose-colored glasses. The polls would suggest the MAGA base is still solidly behind Trump, even with Iran. Now, is there signs of erosion? Yes. Very soft among non-MAGA Republicans. But I also think that it's not irrelevant that many of the most prominent MAGA influencers are fighting with one another over this, because this is kind of unusual. I mean, you've been following this long enough. Usually the criticisms of Trump are sort of walled off from that hermetically sealed world of MAGA. But the MAGA faithful are hearing this debate. They're seeing this debate. They're hearing the criticism. What kind of erosion will that cause? Normally, there's a rally around the flag effect when a war begins. There was no cushion on this war. It was never explained. The explanations are often self-contradictory. It's very, very unclear how deep we're going to get in. So I think that there's the potential for deeper splits. And again, you have to break down MAGA into subgroups. The people who actually believed the America First isolationist, no wars mantra are disillusioned. They are trying to figure this out. But then again, there's a large portion of MAGA that is, you talked about a coalition, and you know how messy coalitions can be. Well, so can cults of personality. I saw a magazine cover, I think it was The Spectator, that said, "Is this the end of Trumpism?" And what I thought is that if the error there is to think of Trumpism as any kind of a coherent set of beliefs or values. A lot of Trumpism is just about whatever Donald Trump says. It is the politics of his whims, and so don't underestimate that particular power. But there's no question about it that the American people are not in favor of this. As you and I are speaking, there seems to be more and more, more reports that we are seriously contemplating boots on the ground, a major escalation. We're sending the Marines there. This has to be, in many ways, the worst case scenario. Donald Trump could have taken many off ramps. He could simply declare victory. He might declare victory an hour from now. But instead, he appears to be caught in the toils of the logic of war, which will lead you from one miscalculation to another.
Yeah, and then becomes harder to pull out of once you dig in. I think he's finding out.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and there's some other splits going on in here as well that I'm observing. So one, it's over basically misogyny, which is like, there's such an odd mix here. So we have sort of the Manosphere, Tate brothers, convicted sex trafficker type group that's part of MAGA. And then you have sort of the Christian right group, which doesn't want to have anything to do with the Andrew Tate stuff. Good. But at the same time, some of them are out there saying stuff like, we should repeal the 19th Amendment, and so it's a different type of misogyny that's going on at the same time. And I don't know if you saw that the New York Times New York Magazine had this article about MAGA women, feeling like, this isn't for me anymore after seeing all the misogyny inside the movement. So that's another split taking place.
Well, there is, and this whole phenomenon is like opening up this can, and all of these were Pandora's box, and all of these demons from another age are coming out here, and some of this rhetoric about repealing the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. This is not going to happen, by the way. But the fact that the incentive structure on the right is such that you can say things like that, and maybe you will get more clicks, maybe you will get more attention. So we're having this moment at which some of the most egregious kind of things are being said, and yes, that is deeply alienating. I would think even to MAGA women who might have signed up for a completely different reason, and and I think that we ought to have the grace to acknowledge that there were people who voted for Donald Trump who actually believed in certain values, who thought that this would lead to certain outcomes. Maybe just economic, or maybe it was the no foreign war, or maybe it had to do with immigration, or maybe it had to do with trans rights or something. And a lot of this noise that you're hearing right now has nothing to do with what they signed up for. And I think that's always the problem. Now, again, I'm sort of thinking back, and again, maybe this is not a good analogy, but how the conservative coalition had been held together by figures like Ronald Reagan, were held together by the Cold War. Once the Cold War ended, once Ronald Reagan departed, you had this incredible, breakup of all of these incompatible, ideas and groups. I have a feeling that a similar thing will happen with MAGA. Once you take Donald Trump himself out of the picture, all of these conflicts are going to burst into view, and many of them are pretty irreconcilable. I mean, if you cannot decide as a political party or political movement that there's no place in it for neo-Nazis, then you have a problem. That should be the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest thing to say, that, okay, we have a diverse set of people, but you know what? We're going to draw the line at Nazis. I mean, if you can't do that, you're in a world of hurt.
Got to draw the line somewhere, man. Come on.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. But I guess the question is, they'll have the breakup and everything, but will they come back together on election day? I guess that's the question.
Well, they will, as long as Donald Trump is on the ballot. Then that's a great question. Will they do the same thing for a J.D. Vance or a Marco Rubio or somebody else? And I think that Democrats seem a little puzzled about why people who are disillusioned with MAGA are not rushing to embrace them. I'm not sure that they have had their own internal debates about, okay, how do we get from where we are right now back to some mythical normality? How do we get there? What kind of a coalition of the decent do we have to create to get there? So I'm hoping that at some point the Democrats realize that their challenge needs to be more than just simply being anti-Trump. They're going to have to address some of these values and some of these concerns of some of these voters who I think, maybe at least temporarily broken loose from the MAGA Borg.
I mean, speaking of Democrats, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the progressives during the Obama administration, how, there was a period of time there where they were just really, feeling their oats, like, we got control, everything's going our way, we're going to push for everything we've always wanted, and nothing's going to stop us. Do you see that sort of comparison as well?
Well, there's always that danger. I mean, we saw that during the Biden parenthesis, where rather than dealing with the crisis in front of us, the prime directive being that you do not allow Donald Trump to come back into power, there were people who say, no, even with our small majorities, if not now, then when? Let's ram it through. Almost all political parties these days overreach because that's what their base demands. They demand, all of their priors, all of the things in their agenda. And I think that that's one of the things that's happening with Trump is that, you could imagine a different version where you slow walked some of these things or explained them or did them in a more reasonable, prudent way would not have engendered the kind of backlash. And I'm talking about immigration, I'm talking about tariffs, a lot of these things. And yet there was apparently that sort of revolutionary Leninist impulse on the right that we have to break things right now. We have to move right now. We may only have a small window, so let's do the maximum amount of damage we can, and damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.
Yeah, and that would be my warning to my Democrat friends. I mean, probably what's going to happen is that they'll do well in the midterms, but it'll be more about the Republican implosion than anything that they're doing well. And of course, they're going to overinterpret it and say, oh, yes, the country's behind Democrats now, but won't be the case.
No, I by the way, this is a very important point, and I agree with you. Did you and I talk about this when we were in Washington? Because
maybe
this is exactly what I'm concerned about. And political parties have historically misread the midterms. I mean, certainly I think Democrats misread the 2022 midterms badly. This is going to be very, very bad for Republicans. But if Democrats decide that this means that we don't have any problems, that we have all the wind at our backs, then I think that would be a fundamental error. Because, once again, there's a reason why right now Donald Trump sits in the White House and Republicans narrowly control the House and they narrowly control the Senate. That didn't just happen overnight. That happened after a decade of Trump telling us who he was over and over and over again. And yet, look who's in power and look who's out of power. That may switch in the midterms, but I'm hoping that we understand that that's just like halftime. That is not the prize. The prize is 2028.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we we saw each other last month in Washington. So this was at the principal's first conference. This is always, I think, it's a good time to kind of gauge sort of the state of the Nevertrump movement. And just for my listeners, understand Nevertrump can sometimes be used to describe everyone who's opposed to Trump. That's not how I'm using this term. To me, Nevertrump are Republicans and former Republicans who oppose Trump. So it's a very specific set of folks. And so when you're looking at sort of, this movement, how it's now like a decade old, right? So where are we at? Where are we going? Is it anything anymore? Or did we just kind of, are we just like sort of sore losers sitting out there doing nothing?
Well, no, it's not sore losers. Yeah, definitely losers in many respects. And quite frankly, I feel no regrets. I feel vindicated over and over and over again. I think one of the reasons why the anti-Trumpers hate Never-Trumpers so much is because they sort of remind them that, remember when you had values, when you actually believed in things, when you weren't willing to make these kinds of compromises, it's possible we're still here. Now, my disappointments are... Well, it would begin with the question of, is Never-Trump, was it really going to be speaking to these disaffected Republicans? There is a huge segment of the voters in the center who I think were appalled and repelled by Donald Trump. And unfortunately, and I've said this publicly before, unfortunately, I think there was a large segment of the Never-Trump movement that simply became liberal Democrats. That have aligned themselves with every progressive, fashionable cause, have chased everybody, and are really indistinguishable from, the Pod Save America folks. And now, once you've done that, you can be commercially successful, but you're not going to be politically successful because the people you need to talk to have tuned you out. Now, I am not casting stones here because, of course, I was an MSNBC contributor. So you could certainly say, well, Charlie, I mean, weren't you part of that whole movement where you became the designated housebroken, former conservative who's going to say exactly what we want you to say? And, I think if we're in a period where we look back and say, I got that wrong, I do regret the fact that Never-Trump was not a more forceful forceful advocate for centrist politics in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, because I do feel that many of those centrist Democrats and Republicans are feeling a little bit alienated and homeless.
Yeah, for sure. And now we have some Never-Trumpers I've noticed are running for office, but as Democrats now. So you have three examples: George Conway, and is that New York, I believe?
New York, yes.
Jeff Duncan in Georgia, and David Jolly in Florida. Maybe just a one-off thing, or could this be like a new thing, that a new coalition within the Democratic Party, or is it too small to really matter at this point?
Well, I would hope that there would be. I would hope there would be, and even though it's small, it's enough to tip the balance in many of the swing states. And this, of course, was the theory of the case in 2024, that if you could move, say, 3 to 5% of the vote in places like Wisconsin, you could make a difference. Now, that didn't play out. I say this as somebody that appeared at an event in late October of 2024 with Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris, and it was in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And the belief was, okay, let's speak to some of these disillusioned conservative Republicans who vote in the suburbs. And there has been significant erosion of support among suburban Republicans. But I think that by that point, you had many conservatives who had tuned out the campaign, that it was not simply enough to do all of that. And I don't regret doing that, but I'm also aware of what was missing in the message. A genuine appeal to centrist voters on cultural issues, on social issues, because I think there's still this impulse on the part of Democrats to think, that, well, these are not real issues. These are not as important as what we care about. These are made up issues. And the fact is, no, they are issues that you're losing 80-20 on some of them, and voters do actually care about them. So pretending they don't matter or pretending that we can talk about something else has been a formula that they've tried, and it's failed over and over and over again. The question is, will they continue to do the same thing in 26 and 28?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you about that. I mean, the Democrats. I hate to like keep harping on the Democrats because I'm not a Democrat, and so it's like, who am I to tell them what to do?
Yeah, well, thing. I get that too.
Okay, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, there's just y'all are being. I think the Democrats are being misled by their advisors on a lot of areas. They're not taking good advice. There's just a lot of folks who are just kind of hanging in the wind because they cannot support Republicans, but they don't see any alternative in the Democrats as well.
This of course is the dilemma, and because I do think that there's real potential out there. I think that there's a segment of the electorate that is very much in play, and it's a very large segment of the electorate. It is not small. Look, you're talking about right now polls which would suggest that Donald Trump is in almost uncharted territory of unpopularity. That does not necessarily translate into votes for Democrats that do not speak to the concerns of voters. So we started off talking about the Nevertrump movement, and I've given so much thought to this, obviously being part of it, because I think that when I wrote my book, How the Right Lost Its Mind, in late 2016 and early 2017, I was trying to figure out what just happened. How deep does this run? Where are we going to go? I think I was naive enough to believe that there was still going to be this remnant, a very powerful remnant of the Republican Party that would at some point say no to Donald Trump, reject his policies, and that would create an alternative, that there would be a core of Republicans that would survive. In fact, that did not happen. They have been almost completely purged, excommunicated, driven out of the Republican Party. There's no, if we talked about never-Trumpers among elected Republicans, Napp, you and I could probably count them on one hand. And I'm talking about Congress, yeah. One hand. So clearly, in this period of hyper-partisanship, that particular project failed. And then, of course, I wish we'd been more successful in speaking to, in speaking to some of the swing voters. And I don't mean to be euphemistic here. I know here from being here in Wisconsin, it was very difficult for me as somebody who had been associated with the pro-life movement for many, many years to try to talk to people and say, you need to vote for a Democrat now because Trump is X, Y, and Z. But what about that issue? People are not simply going to change all their values. Here in Wisconsin, the whole issue of transgender athletes, which so many of the smart kids say is not an important issue. You could not avoid that. They pounded that in day after day after day in the ads, and there was never a good response to it. Until you're able to talk to those people, then I have a problem. Now, again, I am sensing that there is more higher profile of Christians, people from the church, who are speaking out about the cruelty, the dishonesty, things like and the way the war is being conducted, immigration, and I do hold out some hope that many of these things will be so offensive to the conscience of centrist, socially conservative voters that there will be a shift. But I'm not sure the Democrats have fully positioned themselves to take advantage of that.
Yeah, which just leaves us in like a big gray zone as far as trying to make sense of what's going to happen with the political parties post-Trump, right?
Exactly. Yes, very much so.
All right. Charlie Sykes, you can find Charlie's podcast on Substack, and his newsletter on Substack is called To the Contrary. Anything else you have coming up you want to tell us about?
Well, no, you can also catch us on YouTube. And, these issues that we're talking about are, a theme that runs through a lot of what we write about, a lot of what we talk about, trying to figure this out, trying to provide a platform for the voices who are going to uphold these values. I know that there is a tendency on the part of some folks to say that all of these conservative ideas, they were all a lie all along. They were not lies. Many of them were aspirational, but they are still important. And unless you can talk to those voters, we're not going to make any progress. So I wish I was doing a better job of breaking people out of their bubbles, but it's part of my agenda, trying to do it. So thank you very much for the invitation today.
Yes, and if you enjoy the AVC podcast, you definitely want to check out Charlie Sykes' podcast. You'll appreciate that as well. Charlie Sykes, thanks for being such a great friend of AVC, and thanks for coming on today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.